Hey, my name is Dave Kingston, and I am the Director of Learning and Human Performance Solutions for Concurrent Technologies Corporation. And one of the things I'm going to talk about here is something that, we want to make sure that we don't lose sight of, and the fact that live instruction is still going to be very important to us. There's a lot of virtual instruction being done, a lot of virtual instruction being talked about if you took a look around the exhibit hall. And we obviously do that as well, but live instruction is still very important. But in my opinion, there's a right way and a wrong way to do that. And I want to talk to you about what we did to support the U.S. Army Engineer School to make it better. Well, here's the problem. I happen to be an instructor. We were fortunate enough to win a contract to support the engineer school in their general engineering instruction for their captain's career course. And in this case, literally, I gave a class in which I was handed a deck of 192 PowerPoint slides in an hour to go through for general engineering instruction. And literally these captains who had just returned from Iraq and Afghanistan were literally sitting there, and they had done some of these things in the field, but some of them they hadn't. But the bottom line is they were like being PowerPointed to death with this many slides. And in the end, they still didn't know how to do the task that they were supposed to be able to do. So, and you can see some of the things there that there was no immersion, little hands-on instruction. Obviously, you can imagine what the the feedback of the students were. But on top of that is from the field, these captains would show up in the field and not being able to perform these tasks that they were supposedly learning in the schoolhouse. So you can see all kinds of negative things by having these classroom environments of 192 PowerPoint slides. In the end, students not knowing what they're supposed to know. So we were actually tasked by the engineer school to come up with fixes to the curriculum, and we actually, for the engineer officer basic course, for example, we took a look at this thing, and we took a different approach. What I thought was that what we're going to do here is, instead of spending so much time in the classroom, we're going to actually focus on live training out in the field. And so rather than have 192 PowerPoint slides on how to do something without really doing it in a classroom, we take them out in a field environment and actually have them do it. And that's really exactly what we did. This required us to develop scenarios that were really lifelike, almost like a training lane for individuals. It also required for safety briefings, because now we had them out there with equipment. And safety is such an important part of the Army anyhow, that we wanted them to incorporate safety in everything that they did anyhow, so it just reinforced it. The other thing it did is TRADOC has a model in the U.S. Army for resourcing. It's called the, if the resource requirements are not in the automated systems approach to training database, then the resources will not be available to actually conduct this training. So this is the other added benefit, is by identifying the resource requirements to execute this training, it became part of the ASAT database, and therefore the Army could actually properly resource this training. So let me just talk you through an example. Again, I'm a professional engineer. I'm a retired engineer colonel, and so this was very near and dear to me, is to make sure we had engineer officers that could actually show up knowing how to do basic engineering tasks. Here's a case here where we actually ended up with, I wanted to make sure that engineer officers knew how to properly lay in grade stakes, for example, or how to do a compaction test, really knowing how to do a compaction test by doing a compaction test. Things like that. So instead of getting PowerPoint slides on how to do it, we created scenarios that required them to do it in a field environment with the actual equipment that they would use in the field. Here's an example where we divided the group, the class, into 5 groups. And at each, it's a round robin kind of thing where each station required them to actually conduct various tasks using hands-on equipment and actually going through the actual procedures. Here's some example. We talked about the risk analysis, and this was a great example because we had actual equipment moving it around there. It gave them a real example of how to do a risk analysis, which is very important to any construction activity we're going to do anyhow. You can see such things as production rates for dozers, lay grade stakes. This is what we saw was that the Army in the field, they had officers that didn't know how to lay in grade stakes. Compaction tests after roller operations. Again, officers showing up in the field not knowing how to do that. So here's another example. Here's one of the stations that we created, right? So here's the station 4, where we actually required them to actually lay in actual grade stakes using a survey team, which again, lieutenants are supposed to be able to supervise using the actual surveyed equipment. We actually caused them to actually lay in the grade stakes and actually do a QA check, just like they would have to in the field, so that no kidding would they not just see a PowerPoint presentation, but they would actually lay them in. And there would be no mistake then about how to properly put in a grade stake. So we have the tasks, conditions, and the standards, and then we also have notes for the instructors. One of the things that we notice is when you do PowerPoint presentations, the instructors really don't have to be that skilled. But when they're out there actually doing the actual operation, then you need a different kind of instructor that is really engaged, really knows what needs to be done, and we have to give some more detailed instruction to that instructor so that he actually knows what kind of coordination needs to be done in advance so that the training actually takes place. Notice that we have a survey team requirement in this case, and we want the survey team to actually go out in advance and pre-survey that area so they know exactly what the grade stakes requirements are anyhow. Here's another one here where we have tasks to perform quality control checks after road grading operations. It's the same idea where we actually have the actual instructors or the students actually performing his QA checks on the actual road grading operation as they see it. Notice again we have notes for the instructor. Requires the instructor to be a lot more skilled at this task than he would be if he was just flipping PowerPoint charts. So what are the benefits of us doing these round robin where they're actually hands-on? Well, there's a number of them. First of all, you know, we're creating immersive live training. You know, we talk about immersive virtual training a lot. This is actually immersive live training, which is just as important, I think. The resources for these training events are now fully documented, and they're in the automated systems approach to training database, and therefore the Army then can properly resource these training requirements. The instructors there are actually then also given the very detailed instructions that they need, that they're going to need to know in order to actually pull this training off. By the way, it does require, and this is the other thing that we notice, is like some of those instructors at the engineer school, because of all the deployments that they had, some of them were really not the subject matter expert that they really needed to be. This does require them to become subject matter experts. So that's one of the things that and as it should be. We should not have instructors that are not subject matter experts anyhow. The other thing is it actually changes the role of the instructor itself. Instead of like just being an instructor, he's more of a mentor, teacher. He's out there where these groups are actually doing it live. He's actually talking to them, hey, did you consider this? What about that? Did you think about that? Things like that straight PowerPoint presentations would never allow an instructor to be able to do that. Okay, so this concludes my presentation on how to take live instruction from the classroom to a field environment to make it much more relevant to today's warfighter. And subject to your questions, this concludes my presentation.